What happens when loyalty means nothing and experience becomes a liability? Today, I'm going to tell you about Brian Garcia, a man who thought he was building something permanent, only to discover that in the corporate world, nothing is ever truly yours. "We're restructuring the creative department," Director Amanda Chen announced, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Fresh perspectives, new energy. The industry is evolving, and we need to evolve with it." Brian Garcia, 42 years old, sat in that sterile conference room, watching his career dissolve in real time. 12 years. 12 years of late nights, weekend campaigns, and ideas that had generated over $50 million in revenue for Morrison Creative Agency in downtown Chicago. And now, they were calling it restructuring. Amanda slid a folder across the mahogany table. "Your severance package is quite generous. We appreciate everything you've contributed." Brian smiled, that practiced, professional smile he'd perfected over a decade of client presentations. "I understand. Thank you for the opportunity." But inside, something cold was crystallizing, something that would change everything. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story isn't just about corporate betrayal. It's about what happens when a company mistakes an employee for an asset they own, instead of recognizing them as the architect of their success. Brian had joined Morrison Creative when it was barely a $5 million operation. Fresh out of Northwestern with an MBA and a head full of ideas, he'd been hired by founder David Morrison himself. "I need someone who thinks differently," David had said. "Someone who can see opportunities others miss." For 12 years, Brian had been exactly that person. He'd created the Everyday Heroes campaign for Midwest Bank that increased their customer base by 300%. He'd developed the viral Real Chicago series for the tourism board that generated over 100 million impressions. His fingerprints were on every major campaign that had built Morrison Creative's reputation. But success, Brian would learn, sometimes makes you a target. Amanda Chen had arrived 18 months ago as creative director, brought in from a New York agency with promises of industry connections and cutting-edge strategies. She wore designer suits, spoke in marketing buzzwords, and had never once asked Brian about his client relationships or campaign insights. The warning signs had been there. Brian's office had been relocated during a space optimization project. His name disappeared from key client emails. His project budgets started requiring additional approvals. But the real betrayal had been happening behind closed doors. While Brian was focused on delivering results for clients, Amanda had been systematically documenting his work, cataloging his processes, and preparing to replace him with a team of junior creatives who would cost half his salary. "We are research you. Your ideas are valuable," she'd told him during their final one-on-one meeting. "We just need to scale them more efficiently." Translation: "We want your intellectual property without paying for your experience." Brian packed 12 years of his professional life into 2 cardboard boxes. Awards, client letters, campaign mock-ups, memories of battles won and relationships built. As he cleaned out his desk, Sarah from accounting approached. "Moving to a new office?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Something like that," Brian replied, not wanting to make a scene. But as he rode the elevator down for the last time, Brian wasn't thinking about unemployment benefits or job searches. He was thinking about the client presentation scheduled for next week, the one where TechFlow Industries would decide whether to renew their $2.3 million annual contract. They didn't know yet that their creative director, the man who'd increased their market share by 40% over 3 years, was no longer with the agency. Brian's phone started buzzing before he'd even reached his car. Marcus Webb from TechFlow Industries. Hey Brian, looking forward to the presentation next week. The board is excited to see what you've got planned for Q4. Brian stared at the message. Marcus had been his client for 4 years. They'd built a relationship based on trust, results, and mutual respect. Marcus didn't work with Morrison Creative, he worked with Brian Garcia, and Amanda Chen had no idea what she'd just done. That evening, Brian sat in his Lincoln Park apartment, bourbon in hand, looking out at the Chicago skyline. His wife Elena was visiting her mother in Phoenix, taking their teenage daughter Sophia with her. The timing was perfect. He needed the quiet to think. Brian pulled out his personal laptop and began reviewing his employment contract. The non-compete clause was standard, 1 year limited to direct competitors. But there was something interesting in the termination language. Being fired for restructuring was different from being fired for cause. The legal restrictions weren't as tight as they initially seemed. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Jessica Park from Horizon Retail. Brian, we need to discuss the holiday campaign timeline. Can you call me tomorrow? Then another message from David Kim at Urban Development Group. Ready to finalize the Q1 strategy. When's our next meeting? Brian realized something that Amanda Chen and David Morrison hadn't considered. His clients weren't just buying campaigns from Morrison Creative. They were buying Brian Garcia's strategic thinking, his understanding of their businesses, his ability to translate their vision into results. And that wasn't something that could be easily transferred to a junior creative team. The next morning, Brian made a decision that would reshape the entire Chicago advertising landscape. He wouldn't badmouth Morrison Creative. He wouldn't try to steal clients. He would simply inform his closest contacts that he was no longer with the agency, effective immediately. The rest would happen naturally. His first call was to Marcus Webb. Marcus, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. I'm no longer with Morrison Creative as of yesterday. What? Marcus's voice was sharp with surprise. What happened? Restructuring. Amanda Chen will probably reach out about the transition. A long pause. The woman from the last meeting? She doesn't understand our industry, Brian. Hell, she doesn't understand our company. I can't advise you on what to do, Brian said carefully. I just wanted you to know. Where are you landing? Marcus asked immediately. I'm exploring options. Well, wherever you go, that's where our business is going too. By noon, Brian had made similar calls to 5 other major clients. Professional, factual, no sales pitch. Just information delivered with the same reliability they'd come to expect from him. By 3 p.m., his phone was ringing constantly. Word travels fast in Chicago's advertising community. At 4:30 p.m., David Morrison called. Brian let it go to voicemail. Brian, this is David. We need to discuss your transition plan. Several clients are asking questions. Call me back immediately. Brian didn't return the call. Instead, he drove to meet with Robert Chen, an employment attorney who'd been a college friend. They'd stayed in touch over the years, and Brian had even helped Robert's firm with some pro bono creative work. They can't prevent you from working, Robert confirmed after reviewing Brian's termination papers. But they'll try to intimidate your clients. Be prepared for that. At 6 p.m., Morrison Creative's legal team sent Brian an email reminding him of his confidentiality obligations. At 7 p.m., Amanda Chen texted, "Let's discuss consulting opportunities. We value your expertise." Too late. By then, TechFlow Industries had already sent formal notice terminating their contract, citing changes in account management structure. Horizon Retail followed an hour later. Urban Development Group sent their termination notice the next morning. Within 48 hours, Morrison Creative had lost $7.8 million in annual contracts. David Morrison called an emergency board meeting. Brian knew because Sarah from accounting texted him. "Complete chaos here. Amanda blaming you for client interference. David asking why nobody saw this coming." Meanwhile, Brian's phone was ringing with opportunity. The advertising world had taken notice of Morrison Creative's sudden client exodus, and everyone wanted to know where Brian Garcia was landing. The most interesting call came from Michael Torres, founder of Apex Creative Group, a boutique agency with a reputation for innovation and client satisfaction. "Brian, I've been following your work for years. I hear you're available, and I'd like to discuss a partnership opportunity." "Partnership?" Brian was intrigued. "Senior Vice President, equity stake, complete creative autonomy, and the resources to build something special. When can we meet?" They met that afternoon. The offer was everything Brian had wanted at Morrison Creative, but never received. Respect, ownership, and the freedom to work with clients the way he knew was most effective. Brian accepted on the spot. Within a week of joining Apex Creative, Brian had signed 6 of his former Morrison Creative clients. Not because he'd recruited them, but because they'd followed him naturally, drawn by the promise of continuing to work with someone who understood their businesses. The industry was buzzing. Brian Garcia's move to Apex Creative had become the talk of Chicago advertising circles. Then Brian learned something that changed everything. Sarah from accounting called him on his personal phone. "You need to know what really happened," she said. It wasn't just about fresh perspectives. Brian listened as 12 years of history rearranged itself into a clearer picture. "They were planning to sell the agency," Sarah explained. "Wellington Capital made an offer 3 months ago, but they wanted to restructure the creative department first. They saw your client relationships as a risk factor, too dependent on one person." The pieces fell into place. Amanda Chen hadn't been hired to improve creativity. She'd been brought in to systematically document Brian's processes, transfer his client relationships to junior staff, and prepare the agency for acquisition. His termination wasn't about performance or restructuring. It was about making Morrison Creative look like a company that could function without its key talent. "How do you know this?" Brian asked. "I handle the executive communications. I've seen the documents, heard the conference calls. Yesterday, Wellington pulled their offer. They won't acquire without the client base you built." After hanging up, Brian sat in his new office, larger and brighter than his old one at Morrison Creative, and processed the deeper betrayal. For 12 years, he'd been loyal to a company that had been actively planning to eliminate him. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd succeeded too well. His relationships with clients were too strong, too personal. Wellington Capital wanted to buy an agency, not a collection of personal relationships that could walk away. Brian's phone buzzed with a text from David Morrison. "Can we meet? Just you and me. No lawyers." Brian didn't respond immediately. The full scope of the betrayal was still settling in. They'd been willing to sacrifice him to make their company more attractive to buyers. Instead of meeting with David, Brian called Marcus Webb. "I need to ask you something. Did Morrison Creative introduce you to anyone from Wellington Capital recently?" "How did you know?" Marcus sounded surprised. "They brought in some consultant about 2 months ago. Said he was evaluating our industry segment for strategic opportunities." More calls revealed the same pattern. While Brian was still employed, still delivering results, Morrison Creative had been secretly introducing Wellington representatives to his clients, testing whether the relationships could survive his departure. By the end of the day, Brian had confirmed that 7 of his major clients had been covertly approached by Wellington Capital, all under the guise of strategic consulting. Brian finally texted David Morrison back, "No meeting necessary. I understand the Wellington situation completely." David's response was immediate. "It was a business decision, Brian. Nothing personal." But it was personal. 12 years of building relationships, of knowing clients' business challenges intimately, of working weekends and holidays to deliver results, all reduced to an impediment to corporate acquisition. Brian closed his laptop and looked out at the Chicago skyline from his new office. The view was different here, clearer somehow. Apex Creative had already signed contracts with 9 of Brian's former clients, representing $12 million in annual revenue. More were coming. Morrison Creative hadn't just lost a creative director. They'd lost the foundation their client relationships were built on. 3 weeks after joining Apex Creative, Brian received an invitation to keynote the Chicago Advertising Awards. The irony wasn't lost on him. He accepted, not for ego, but because he knew who would be in that audience. Industry peers, potential clients, and most importantly, Morrison Creative's leadership team. Brian spent a month preparing, working with Apex's data team to compile performance metrics for every client who had followed him. The results were impressive. Average campaign performance up 35%, client satisfaction scores increased by 28 points, project delivery times reduced by 40%. The morning of the event, Brian reviewed his notes one final time. No dramatic revelations, no naming names, just data and outcomes. As he entered the hotel ballroom, he spotted David Morrison immediately, surrounded by board members near the registration table. David's expression tightened when he saw Brian. Brian nodded politely and moved on. Brian's keynote focused on the importance of authentic client relationships in an increasingly digital world. He presented case studies, without naming companies, showing how personalized creative strategies outperformed templated approaches. In an age of automation and artificial intelligence, Brian said, the human element becomes more valuable, not less. Clients don't just buy campaigns, they buy trust, understanding, and results. During the Q&A, someone asked the question everyone was thinking. Your recent move from Morrison Creative to Apex, along with several major clients, seems to prove that client relationships are more personal than companies would like to admit. How should agencies address this reality? The room went silent. Brian could feel David Morrison's eyes on him. That's an excellent question, Brian replied. I think companies need to decide whether they want to build institutions or just optimize transactions. My former clients didn't follow me out of personal loyalty. They followed because their business needs were better served through a relationship-focused approach. He paused, making brief eye contact with David. When companies treat creative directors as interchangeable resources, clients will demonstrate exactly how wrong that assumption is. After the keynote, 3 more former Morrison Creative clients approached Brian. By the end of the evening, Apex Creative had signed letters of intent with 4 new accounts representing $3.2 million in annual revenue. That night, Brian checked the industry news. Morrison Creative had announced a strategic refocus. Amanda Chen was pursuing new opportunities. The Wellington Capital acquisition was officially dead. Brian closed his laptop without satisfaction or triumph. Just the quiet certainty that the market had delivered its verdict. The lesson had been taught. Whether they would learn from it was no longer his concern. 6 months after his termination, Brian stood in Apex Creative's main conference room, surrounded by his team and the company's partners. On the screen behind him, A single slide displayed their quarterly results. $18.7 million in new business, 85% from former Morrison Creative clients. Michael Torres raised a glass. To the best partnership we've ever formed. Brian smiled but didn't join the celebration. This wasn't about victory for him. It was about validation. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Morrison Creative announces CEO transition. David Morrison steps down amid continued revenue challenges. Brian slipped the phone back into his pocket without showing anyone. Some victories don't need an audience. Later that afternoon, Brian received an email from Amanda Chen. Congratulations on your success. Any chance Apex is hiring? I think I misunderstood the creative process. Brian forwarded it to HR with a note. Worth a conversation. Everyone deserves a second chance. As he was leaving the office, his assistant handed him an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from David Morrison. You were right about relationships mattering more than transactions. I let the acquisition potential blind me to what really drove our success. If you're ever willing to have coffee, I'd appreciate the chance to apologize in person. Brian folded the note and placed it in his jacket pocket. Maybe someday. Not yet. 1 year to the day after Amanda Chen had slid those termination papers across the conference table, Brian signed the final documents, making him a full partner at Apex Creative. The firm had grown 127% since his arrival. Elena entered his office with 2 cups of coffee. Signed and official? Signed and official, Brian confirmed. She studied his face. You don't look as happy as I expected. Just thinking about what comes next, Brian said. About building something that lasts. That morning, Brian had approved a new profit-sharing structure for all senior staff. No one would build something at Apex Creative only to have it taken away. That was his first act as partner. Brian's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Webb. Congratulations on the partnership. Knew you'd land on your feet. Thanks to clients like you, Brian replied. No, Marcus corrected. Thanks to you being who you are. We just followed the value. After hanging up, Brian looked at the framed photo on his desk. Elena and Sophia at last year's Christmas party. Something he'd almost missed for a client emergency in his previous life. He picked up his calendar and blocked out time for Sophia's upcoming school play. Some things were more important than quarterly reviews. Brian shut down his computer and walked toward the elevator. Through the windows, he could see Morrison Creative's building across the downtown skyline. The company logo was being removed from the facade. The Business Journal had reported they were downsizing to a smaller office in the suburbs. Brian didn't pause to look. He kept walking, eyes forward, toward the life he was building on his own terms. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply building something better, something that recognizes the value of human relationships in an increasingly transactional world. Sometimes the market delivers justice more efficiently than any lawsuit or scheme for vengeance. Brian Garcia had learned that lesson the hard way. And in learning it, he'd discovered something even more valuable. That when you're truly good at what you do, when you genuinely care about your clients and colleagues, the world has a way of recognizing that value, even when your former employer doesn't. And that's the story of Brian Garcia. A man who discovered that loyalty might not be reciprocated, but value always finds a way to surface. Sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to you, if you're ready to bet on yourself. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something similar? Let me know in the comments below.